Hey everybody, Miss Dumas here, and today we're going to talk Cold War. This is the start of Unit 8, and the Cold War will run from 1945 to 1990. Now, by the end of this presentation, what Mr. Booren and I hope you get out of it is, number one, being able to explain the historical context of the Cold War, or what led up to the Cold War. Then we also want you to be able to explain some causes and effects of the Cold War, the ideological struggle that we are about to hit upon. Now, a little historical context. World War II lasts 6 years, 1939 to 1945, and we know that the Axis powers, such as Japan, Germany, and Italy, are definitely going to be suffering at the end of the war because they lose, but even the Allied powers, like Britain and France and the United States, who won the war, they were suffering as well. You have to understand that the amount of land and life and resources that were destroyed as a result of World War II are going to have just as much of a negative impact on the Allied powers as it will on the Axis powers. So basically, Europe is in a world of hurt. And for the first time in a very long time, Western Europe is going to have almost no power. So it's kind of slid from the pinnacle of power at the beginning of the 20th century, and now it's really got very little as a result of World War II. And in fact, there are only going to be two nations that emerge from World War II with any kind of semblance of power, and that will be the United States and the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, we're going to see a new world order. Now, before we get into that, we have to understand what is going to lead the United States and the Soviet Union to be at odds with each other. Remember, they're allies during World War II. So what happens that changes that gets the Soviet Union and the United States to distrust each other, to realize they can't play on the same side? So what I want you to do is click on this video, and I want you to take notes on two things. I want you to take notes on a couple of major decisions made at the meetings of Yalta and Potsdam, but then I also want you to take some notes on what is going to lead to the distrust or mistrust between the Soviet Union and the United States. So go ahead, hit click on that video, take some notes, and when you're done, come on back. So hopefully what you were able to see that at Yalta and Potsdam, some good things were created. The Soviet Union agreed to help the United States in its war against Japan after the War of Germany was over. You saw that Stalin promised to give free elections in Eastern Europe. You saw that Germany was going to be divided up amongst the Allied powers in order to make sure the rebuilding of Germany could take place. But the biggest issues are the mistrust that was seeded during those meetings. And from the United States side, they wouldn't trust Stalin because those free elections he promised didn't happen. In fact, what he did is install puppet governments in countries such as Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary. And what puppet governments or satellite states basically are those were governments in these countries who were really pro-Stalin, pro-Soviet Union. Basically, if the Soviet Union said jump, these puppet governments would say how high. And they weren't elected by the people, they were forced in by Stalin and the Soviet Union. So the United States is already very apprehensive about Stalin. They don't think that he's going to stop spreading communism past Eastern Europe. They don't like what he did in Eastern Europe. So the idea that they're going to be able to trust him and work with him, yeah, that's going to fly out the window. And from the Soviet Union perspective, when Truman says, hey, by the way, we have an atomic bomb, do you, at Potsdam, that infuriates Stalin, right? Because Truman only did that to intimidate Stalin and say, if you make us mad, we've got bigger guns than you do. And so right there, we're going to see the breaking apart of the United States and the Soviet Union as allies. And what it's going to lead to is two very different sides and two very different opinions as to how this new world order should run. Oh, you gotta love Frankie Goes to Hollywood there. Song Two Tribes, definitely about the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the song is true. There are two sides, and there is no middle ground. So the Cold War, which begins roughly around 1946, is going to involve the Soviet Union and its desire to spread communism throughout the world, and the United States, whose goal is to stop the spread of communism and promote capitalism and promote democracy. And we call this an ideological struggle because it is a struggle between ideologies, the ideology of communism and the ideology of capitalism and democracy. And both these nations want to win. The Soviet Union wants the world to be communist. The United States wants the world to be capitalist and democratic, and they're going to fight each other in this 45-long-year war in order to make that happen. Now, by fight each other, I don't mean directly, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So, in fighting the Cold War, there are numerous strategies both the United States and the Soviet Union use. The first one is espionage. That's spying. So you would see Soviet spies in America, American spies in the Soviet Union trying to get all the top secrets, trying to figure out what nation's next move is going on. And so this was the favorite way to gain information during the Cold War. Both nations would also offer foreign aid and military aid. This was more used by the United States, but the idea was if we could basically bribe nations with aid, they would follow our side, not the enemy's side. As well, both nations will use propaganda. Lots of propaganda. Lots and lots of propaganda. The Soviet Union is going to portray the United States as evil, and the United States is going to portray the Soviet Union as evil. Then we also have proxy wars. If you remember on the last slide, I said that the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fought each other. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because both sides possessed nuclear weapons and eventually an arsenal of nuclear weapons on each side. And it became apparent really early on that if anyone were to launch a nuclear weapon, it would end up in what's known as mutually assured destruction. We'd blow the planet up. So the United States and the Soviet Union decided that fighting each other directly is not going to happen because it would most likely end up in the blowing up of the world. So what they did is they would go into other nations and support rival sides and engage in their wars as a way to spread communism or stop the spread of communism. Some examples of this are the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And finally, the last policy that they tried is called brinkmanship. And that's basically bringing everything to the brink, taking everything to the edge, pushing it as far as you can go without actually blowing up the entire planet with nuclear weapons. So anytime the United States or the Soviet Union threatened to launch a nuclear weapon, that's what brinkmanship is. And both sides did all of this all of the time during the Cold War. The Cold War itself is going to begin in Europe. Now remember, these nations right here, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, all these nations are already controlled by Soviet puppet governments. Western Europe, however, is not controlled. They're still in the process of rebuilding and deciding which side they truly want to be on. And this is where the United States policy of containment comes in. So I think of containment like capturing a spider in the glass. The spider's there and you put the glass over it so it can't escape anywhere else. That's kind of what containment is. This idea that we are going to contain communism to where it's already at and not let it spread any further. And for the United States, what that meant is there is communism in Eastern Europe, but we are not going to let communism spread outside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. No other nation on the planet is going to be communist. The United States is going to contain it. And the way they're going to do that is by offering military and economic aid. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to click on the Truman Doctrine, and the link will take you to a very brief article about what the Truman Doctrine did to contain communism. So what I want you to do is hit pause on this video, go to that article, read it, and jot down some notes about what the Truman Doctrine is and how it stopped the spread of communism. And when you're done, come on back. So hopefully now you know what the Truman Doctrine is. It was a foreign and military aid package that was given to Greece and Turkey in order to help those nations combat communist forces who were threatening to take over. And by economic and military aid, we mean weapons, we mean tanks, we mean bombs. That's your military aid. And the whole purpose of the military aid was to strengthen the military so they could fight back against communist forces. The economic part was more economics to improve infrastructure, maybe to rebuild buildings and businesses so that people could have jobs and they could have an income and they could live a decent life. And the thought process was, if the economy is going really well and people have enough money and have jobs, they're not going to turn to communism. And that makes sense, because if we think about the reasons that the people turned to communism in Russia, aka the Soviet Union, it's because their economic lives were so miserable. Well, if you don't have a miserable economic life, you're not going to turn to communism. So by offering the economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey, they were kind of attacking communism for two fronts. And guess what? It works. Greece and Turkey remain democratic and capitalist. And so this is a win for United States communism, at least in Southern Europe. But now we've got to talk about Western Europe, because this is where a lot of the rebuilding is going to have to take place. And Western Europe has economic problems right now. Their infrastructure has been destroyed. Their industry's been destroyed. There is unemployment. It's pretty nasty. And again, those are conditions that make a nation ripe for communism. And the United States wanted to contain communism. So what the United States did with the Marshall Plan is offer any European nation kind of sort of free money. They're like, hey, here's the deal. We know you need to rebuild. We're going to help you do that. Take some cash. The only caveat, the only deal is you got to be democratic. That's it. As long as you're democratic, we want to give you money to rebuild. How much money? $12.5 billion in 1948 actually. And so any European nation could take us up on this offer. And most European nations will accept the Marshall Plan. They'll take money from the United States, rebuild their economies, rebuild their infrastructure. We also offer the same deal to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but they not so politely said, not a snowball's chance. So the Marshall Plan helped contain communism because it rebuilt the economies of Europe. And again, once people have jobs and their income is good and they can feed their families, going to be less likely to turn to communism. And it works in Western Europe too. It wasn't a single Western European nation who turned communist. So containment seems to really, really be working in Europe. So that's going to be great. So as of, say, 1949, the United States seems to have really contained communism. It has not spread outside of the Eastern European puppet governments. It hasn't spread outside the Soviet Union. And so America seems like they're on the up and up when it comes to the battle between communism and capitalism democracy. But neither side felt completely prepared or felt that economic and military aid would be enough. They also thought they needed some defense systems. And so this is what leads to the creation of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created in 1949 as a response to the threat of communism, and this is a military alliance. And NATO's motto is, an attack on one is an attack on all. So if you were a part of the NATO nation and you were attacked by communist forces, say you were Luxembourg, then the rest of these nations on the screen are going to go help and defend you. And so whether it was Norway or Portugal or Iceland, if you're attacked by forces, everybody else is going to come and help defend you. And it's really interesting that we're talking about this now, as we see that NATO is a big reason for the Ukraine invasion that we have seen recently. The Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Russia's like, over our dead bodies, and this is what leads to the conflict, or at least one of the reasons that leads to the conflict. So NATO is important even today. Now, in response to NATO, the Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact. It's basically the same thing. It's a military organization and a military alliance where an attack on one is an attack on all. Only this alliance is going to cover the Eastern European states and the Soviet Union. So again, if the United States attacks Bulgaria to get rid of communism, all the Warsaw Pact nations would go in and defend Bulgaria. Or if it was Czechoslovakia, they do Czechoslovakia. So both NATO and the Warsaw Pact are military organizations designed for collective security, trying to prevent invasion by having a bunch of weapons and a bunch of nations behind them. Now, when it comes to this bipolar world, we did have some instances where nations chose to be not aligned. Now, don't get me wrong, the United States and the Soviet Union wanted countries to pick side. You either pick the US side or you pick the Soviet Union side, and they offered aid and bribes and all this different stuff to get you to pick sides. But there were some nations out there who said, I don't want to pick sides. A, I don't completely agree with communism. B, I don't completely agree with capitalism. And I don't want to stick our nation in some kind of alliance or agreement that's not going to be best for our people. And so you will see some nations choose non-alignment. Not very many, as you can see on this map. In fact, the big ones who choose non-alignment, the one we're really going to focus on, is India, Indonesia in Southeast Asia, Ghana in Africa, and then Yugoslavia in Europe. And so these nations are like, dude, we're not picking a side. If we need help from the Soviet Union, we'll get help from the Soviet Union. But at the same time, if we need help from the United States, we're going to get help from the United States, because they simply didn't want to paint themselves into a corner. And for a lot of these non-aligned nations, they are able to play the United States and Soviet Union off each other really, really, really well. So that is the summation of the origins of the Cold War, and our learning objective was to A, be able to give historical context to the Cold War, and then describe some causes and effects. So what I want you to do on your note sheet now is I want you to write a 3 to 4 sentence historical context to explain what led to the Cold War, right? Why did this Cold War even start? And then what I want you to do is write a 3 to 4 sentence summary that summarizes what the Cold War looked like in Europe. And that's where you can bring in who was communist, who was not, how the United States contained, what kind of military alliances were created. Now, after you've created these summaries, I want you to go back and review your notes. And if you do that, and you do that with due diligence, you should be ready for the quiz. As always, thanks again for listening. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, you know where to find us. Until next time, see you later.